Before Stranger Things became a cultural phenomenon, I was asked to help animate a title sequence for a show that nobody had ever heard of. This video is going to be a behind-the-scenes look at how the iconic Stranger Things titles came together. I'll share what it was like working on it, what inspired the look, and how we tried to capture that vintage 80s vibe. If you want to see a more technical process inside of After Effects, go check out my other video where I do a tutorial that breaks it down step by step. It was 2016, I was working at Imaginary Forces on some other design project, and this title sequence came to me. It was like a small Netflix TV show, and they wanted to do a title sequence for it. At this point, Michelle, the creative director, had already been working with the Duffer Brothers and presented a couple design ideas to them, and they showed me the design that they were leaning toward, which were like these outlined letters kind of floating in black space. And the brief was sort of like they were looking to create a title sequence that was very reminiscent of titles and TV shows from the 80s. Some of the things that they had referenced were Altered States, The Dead Zone, Pulp Fiction, and they really wanted something that just had like a very kind of slow, ominous vibe. They also had a ton of references of Stephen King books. And if you look at some of the Stephen King books from that era, you'll definitely see some inspiration. And the way that the story was explained to me is it really seemed like something from the 80s that was inspired by the Amblin era of films like The Goonies, because you had this group of kids, but it also had this sort of like supernatural thriller aspect to it that kind of seemed like a mix between Stephen King and Steven Spielberg. And then one thing that you don't usually get is that we actually had the music soundtrack that they're going to put to the title sequence. So that was very helpful and informative of what this thing should look like, because it's like a very heavy synth 80s sounding kind of John Carpenter vibe, and that really set us off in the right direction. Thinking about this is like, this should feel like it was like handmade by a title designer in the 80s that was doing this out of his garage, like optically. And so it should feel kind of imperfect and messy and gritty and all those things that you get from doing something on film. So I first started by putting together a bunch of motion tests. And the first tests that I was doing were sort of like quicker camera moves, almost like the idea of thinking about this because of the story was like this mystery trying to solve like what happened to this missing kid, that these letters were going to be like puzzle pieces kind of that were like sliding in, and you didn't really know what these letters were and stuff. And then eventually, finally, you saw that they all kind of like locked into place and formed the title of the show, Stranger Things. So a lot of my initial tests were sort of quicker movements. And then we started realizing over time that all of the references that were being used were a lot slower, very gradual, and it kind of helped make it a little bit more ominous. And so then we started slowing things down, and then you're just getting like very close-ups of letter forms slowly drifting and moving together. And while we were working on these early tests, the Duffer Brothers were actually still on set shooting the show, and the producers finally realized like, this is too much, like we need to let them focus on shooting. We'll come back to the title sequence once we have everything done and we get into post-production. So then they sort of went into like a hiatus, and we kind of took a break for a month or two. And at that time, in my mind, I'm thinking that that was like a polite way of them firing us. So I was just hoping that they were actually going to come back after a month or two and bring us back on to finish it. And luckily enough, they did. So they finished shooting, and then they came back to us, and then that's really where we hit the ground running. And so I started looking at a lot of the title sequences that were done in the 80s. And by that point, a lot of title sequences were pretty graphical and clean. Like there wasn't a lot of imperfections. And I started picking up on all the little things that you have, like when a title fades in, you get a bit of discoloration. Whenever you see a movie that was shot on film and it's static, the title is always jittering a little bit of flicker from the film grain, all those little things that we noticed. And then you have to kind of go down the path of like, well, how would they have actually created this title sequence in the 80s? And that's what I wanted to do. And back then they would have filmed these out optically. So the way that you would do this back then is you would design the titles or create the letter forms individually, and you would put these onto a piece of film, which would be like high contrast, white on black. And you would put these onto like a backlit surface, and then you would have a camera above it, and you would either move the camera frame by frame if you wanted the letters to drift apart. And so then the first thing that I started doing to try to get ideas of what this would look like for reals is that I just very quickly took like a piece of acetate, like clear plastic, like what you would see on like a school projector or something that you draw on. And I just drew out one of the letter forms with like a black marker. And I took one of the light boxes that we had and put it on top of that, and then just did some photography on top of it to see what it looked like. And it looked pretty clean and perfect, totally even and flat. But in our case, we wanted it to look imperfect and have some of that that grit so that it didn't feel like an After Effects comp. So then I had printed the letter onto the acetate and put it on top of the light box and filmed that. And it was the same thing, it's too clean. So then the next test is that we got a bigger piece of acetate with the logo printed onto it. And I took that and put it on a pane of glass and put some red gel behind it. And I just set the camera up in front of it and just took a light and just started shining it through the letter forms just to see what it would look like, doing like a wide shot just so you could get like an imperfect light source. If you didn't have a light box with smooth, even lighting, you would get like some fall off and some hot spots and things like that. So I was just shooting a bunch of tests, like close-ups of the letter forms, what that would look like, moving the light through it, seeing if you might get some glows or lens flares and things like that. And it really, that test really informed a big part of the way that this stuff looked. One of the biggest things that I noticed was, especially on some of the close-ups when you get to the letter forms, there was like a slight amount of grain on the letter form itself, and it was happening because this was punched in so close that you were seeing some of the grain that was coming from the red gel. So I knew there was going to be film grain on top of the whole thing to make it look like it was shot on film. But the thing I didn't think of was that there would actually be film grain inside of the letter forms that are like stuck onto it and locked to it from the gel that's creating the color of the letter. The other thing is that if you're punched in and if the camera isn't perfectly flat with the pane of glass, you're going to get a little bit of depth of field, a little bit of a fall off with the lens blur. And those imperfections carried through the whole entire piece. But it was still looking a little bit too perfect, and we wanted to capture the sense of glow that the initial design frames had. So then it was kind of going in and pushing that a little bit further to make it look more stylized. And I was looking at a lot of references of title sequences like The Thing and trying to find ways that you would do this practically. The way that the titles burned through, it was really just like a garbage bag that was set on fire. And then part of it was that they had the titles in like a water tank with the same type of setup where you have like a piece of acetate that's cutting out the letter forms. So there was some of that was also inspiring the way that at least the glows would happen. But still, this whole time I'm sort of animating and putting this stuff together, but really my goal was hoping that we could get like an optical printer. Now, these are very hard to find because they don't use these anymore. I came across the title designer Dan Perry, who made the original Star Wars title, like, you know, the classical. He did that. He did Raging Bull, Taxi Driver. He worked with Martin Scorsese a lot. And a lot of the technique for creating title sequences at that time was optical printer. So I was trying to see if maybe we could get a hold of him. And oddly enough, it just so happened that he was scheduled to come to our studio for some reason and do like a talk on title sequences. And it was like the weirdest crossing of paths that I just happened to be looking at him. I even sent our creative director and producer like, hey, can we get in contact with Dan and see if he can help us with this? And then a couple days later, they're like, oh, he's actually coming to the studio so we could talk to him. And it was like the weirdest thing. And so he did come to the studio and he came over to my desk, sat down, and I showed him what we were working on. And I said, look, we're inspired by a lot of the titles that were done in the 80s. And what we really want to make is something that looks authentic to that time period. And so, you know, we were trying to think of wanting to do it optically, like with an optical printer and stuff, and trying to get ideas about what we could do to try to make this as authentic as possible, because this is somebody that was making title sequences during that time. And so he was using optical printers. He was filming these things out on film. You know, it was interesting because he's saying what they were trying to do was they were trying to make their titles look as clean and pristine as possible, almost like what a digital title would look like today. Perfectly clean edges, nothing is like moving or shaking or any of that kind of stuff. But they would have to film their titles over and over and over again because you might get a bump in the camera or something slightly out of focus, or the animation just wasn't as smooth, or something just wasn't working right. And there was just so many like orchestrated pieces that had to work together. And especially when you're doing something on film, it's unpredictable about how it's going to develop and turn out. So for them, it was funny because they're trying to make it look like what we were starting with in After Effects, with just clean vector graphics. But we wanted to go back and try to bring in some of those imperfections. And his advice was sort of like to take this tool that we have with digital technology and then just incorporate all the things that we want to bring back from the era of doing things practically on film. But it was also great because I was able to ask him questions about like, what were some of the things that were happening when you're trying to film these out practically that you were trying to avoid, like that you had to film over and over again for. And there were so so many different ideas and mentioning, but one was that when you are dissolving two shots together, the first frame of that cross dissolve, when two shots are blending together, you might get a pop in the exposure because the first time that those two pieces of film are being joined together, the exposure is doubling up. And so you're having to sort of animate this by hand, but there's no way to get it exactly perfect. You're sort of just guessing as it's animating through the dissolve. So that's something that we incorporated into the sequence. And it was so cool talking to him. Like, I'm a huge fan of Star Wars. So to be sitting there talking to the guy that designed the Star Wars title and animated it, and having him sitting next to me looking at something that I'm working on was like such a cool, surreal moment. There were so many things during that conversation that really just informed what we were doing with our title sequence. And at the end of the day, the purpose of a title sequence is to set the expectation for the viewer. It's usually one of the very first things that you see in a movie or a TV show, and you want to set up the feel of the world. You want to get the audience acclimated to what they're about to watch. So for this, one of the big things was like the mystery coming together with the letters, and that was kind of like the mystery puzzle solving aspect of this kid that went missing. Another one was the very slow way that this was happening, that things are slowly being uncovered and unraveled. And then a big one is the time period that the show takes place. And so that's why we really wanted this to feel true to the 80s. And there's a lot of ways that you could have taken this too far, like made it feel VHS or too 80s, but we really wanted to stick true to what those title sequences are that the Duffers had referenced, like Altered States and a lot of the Richard Greenberg title sequences. And so a lot of it came down to just fine-tuning things, adding the grain, bits of dust and speck, a little bit of exposure adjustments, some flicker. The camera has just a tiny bit of shake to it. It's not exactly perfect. And then maybe adding a little bit of like optical lens glows because light is hitting the lens in a certain way when you're doing it. And all those things, when you do them really subtly, all come together and really give you that overall look and feel. And during the final stages of this, like once we had completed shots, they were still changing out like certain letter forms, you know, like constantly we were trying to get the perfect parts of the letters to show in the first few shots, especially as it slowly gradually reveals and gets further and further away. I got to give the Duffer Brothers a lot of credit because they didn't just sign off on something right away. Like we kept going in and experimenting and trying different letter forms until we got like the right shapes. And we were working on this for probably about 2 months. By the time we were finished, everybody was very happy with it. We thought it was super cool. We knew that we were very proud of it. And I remember thinking like, I thought this was cool because I love things that are simplicity. Like I would definitely say my style is more simplistic, keeping it simple and clean. But I thought like a lot of the title sequences that were being done around that time were like these very elaborate, like 3D title sequences, like Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, a lot of like high-end rendered 3D stuff where things are maybe moving or maybe they're just stationary and the camera is like moving around it. And that was sort of like the trend of title sequences at the time. And what we were doing was almost like completely a 180 from that, where it was just flat, graphical, simple, just the letters themselves. To me, that was the coolest part about the title sequence, is that there was nothing in the title sequence apart from the titles. The whole entire sequence was made up of the letters of the title. But I know that when we release this, people are either going to really be on board with that and think it's cool because of the simplicity, or people are going to think that this is completely lazy. Like there's nothing to the title sequence. It's just a bunch of letters floating in space. And luckily people responded really well to the title sequence, which it's rare that you get to work on a TV show that you actually really like yourself. And I love the show. It's a show that I would have watched regardless of having worked on it. And you don't really get that chance to do that a lot. So it was very cool to work on. And it was just a bonus that we got an Emmy for it. And it just goes to show that titles don't have to be so flashy to be unforgettable. Sometimes it's the simple ideas that really stand out. And I got to give a shout out to Imaginary Forces and Michelle, the creative director who brought me on board, and Arisu and Mitran, who did a lot of the design work early on that the Duffer Brothers approved. And yeah, that was pretty much the whole process. So if you guys want to see like a more technical breakdown where I go inside of After Effects and show you kind of a step-by-step on how I animated it, then go check out my other videos. That's more of like a tutorial type of video. And don't forget to subscribe. If you guys like this kind of stuff, let me know if you want some more behind the scenes process videos like this of other projects that I've worked on. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to do it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And until next time, later.